been a missionary, and I want to get the background of what he's experienced. Because, as we see with Live Not by Lies, the book by Rod Dreher, he said, I got contacted with a lot of people whose parents had lived under communism, and they came to this country and they were really alarmed. They said, this is exactly what we saw happen in our country when they took over. And he said, I kept getting so many of these things. So he kind of talked about that and focused on the essay by the same name with Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And so this is kind of Mike's experience as well. I found Mike through an event that was called County Over Country. And as part of that, you had Mike Truella, who has the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. Their focus is what I believe is exactly what we need to be doing. We need to be coming together at the local level. And that's his dog. He's on the line. We're gonna come to him in just a second. But we need to be focused on building local community, not atomized. They're trying to atomize us because they understand that our strength is when we stand together and how we can come together. And but I wanted to begin with the background. Thank you for joining us, Mike. I really appreciate this. Thank you for
Good
coming.
morning, David. It's good to be here with you.
Good. Thank you for coming on. And let's talk a little bit about your background in Romania. As I started to say, you've seen what a totalitarian situation looks like, and this kind of scares you to see what's happening. Now, tell us a little bit about what you saw in Romania. You were there even after the collapse of communism.
That's correct, David. But my experience with totalitarian regimes goes back much farther. My childhood, I grew up with grandparents who were in Germany, and they had been caught in the eastern sector. And within a year or so after the Second World War, they escaped from the Soviet sector.
Wow.
To the American sector. They left and fled with the clothes on their backs. And so I grew up listening to the stories of what is required in certain situations, what families have to do to survive. So moving forward into the early 90s, my wife and I left our jobs. She was a school teacher and I was working in Silicon Valley. We went back to school and we ended up, God providentially opened the doors for us to go to Romania, first in 92 on a short-term trip, and then we moved there in 93. And everybody was excited because communism had collapsed, but really it ended up being a hybrid of a socialistic corporate quasi-capitalism where the
sounds like America today.
Leaders,
it sounds like America today.
Well, yes, I was going to make that tie-in. And so your party members ended up buying factories, $10 million factories for $100,000, and or mostly Deutschmarks. And so moving from centralization and the wickedness thereof, it was a tremendous burden on the people. We saw firsthand what happens when a currency is devalued. When we went to the country, it was about 17 lei to the dollar, and after 2 years, it was 3,400 lei to the dollar.
Wow!
And it was very difficult for individuals, for families, especially those who were on a fixed income.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly enough, we learned that the people who were not impacted were the people in the rural areas who had access and the capability to produce their own food, to be productive. And
that's key. And that's why I wanted to talk to you about that, because you focused on the agricultural area. And as you point out, the most dangerous thing is how they can use food to control us. When you talk to people there, we were talking, and you mentioned something that an elderly pastor said to you about the conditions that he was in. Tell us a little bit about what he went through, and then what he told you about that.
Well, there was a very hopeful conversation I was a little bit reticent to ask this elderly pastor, but I just sensed that I wanted to hear his story. So I asked him, how did you survive, 45 years under this dictatorship? And he had been beaten and wounded and spent time in jail and prison. And he smiled, and it doesn't translate exactly from Romanian into English, but it's sort of the concept that we as God's people have an unfair advantage. The governmental authorities would make rules and regulations, apply them as they see fit, and God is not with them. God's people have the Holy Spirit with them, and as they would develop these rules and regulations, God would show us, as he said, ways to go above or under or around their systems. And so
that's perfect.
Regardless of artificial intelligence and everything that the state has at their disposal, they do not have God on their side. And that's something that's fundamental that we need to remember. And throughout history, God's people, his remnant people, always come out ahead. So that's very encouraging.
And I want to say I spoke at a conference on transhumanism, and I was talking about all the different technologies and the evil plans and evil things that could be done with this technology, and how likely it was that they were going to use it for evil. And I said, when we look at this, you can look at it just from a technological standpoint, from the power and the wealth that these people have. And I said, it looks absolutely hopeless. But I said, understand throughout history that God has glorified himself by using small, powerless people to defeat this type of thing. Our hope is in God. Our hope is not in our technology. So let's talk a little bit about how we defend this with farming, with food, with natural food. Tell us a little bit about what you were involved with there in Romania, what you saw in the stores, and as you were starting to talk about that, you said what you saw with the people that were the ones who are not affected by this runaway inflation where things went up by a factor of 200 in a short period of time. Prices went up by 200 times. So the people who fared the best were the people who were outside of the cities. They had a community and they're growing food. Is that correct?
Correct. One of the things, we arrived in the country in June of '93, and we had a 3-month-old infant. So my wife predominantly stayed home and I would do the shopping. And as I was learning the ropes, learning the language, I stumbled into a governmental managed grocery store. And it was about the size of a smaller grocery store. And as I went in, there were 3 clerks sitting around on stools with their white coats, enjoying their cigarettes. And they didn't even acknowledge me. There's no other shoppers in there, but I grabbed a carry basket because nobody shopped with a push basket. That's unheard of. And I walked down the first aisle, and from the front of the store to the back of the store, top shelf to the bottom shelf, it's empty.
Wow.
There's nothing on the shelves. So I make a U-turn and I come back up and it's also empty. And as I make another turn to go down the next aisle, the people kind of just looking at me and I can't quite hear what they're saying, but it's like probably something like, who is this fool looking to buy food? Well, I was pleasantly surprised when I turn the next aisle and I start going down, and from the front of the store to the back of the store, the top shelf to the bottom, all the way back, it's full of jars of food. So I go up and I pick up a jar, and I didn't recognize the food immediately, and the label was in Romanian and in Russian. And then I identified they're kind of a bluish gray color. They were peas.
Huh.
And it said, made in Russia. But both sides of the aisle, from the front to the back, were full. And then, so I went a little farther, I picked up another jar. And so there's thousands of jars of peas. So I go to the next aisle, and the same thing. It's full of thousands of jars of peas. So
there's a
so
policy of appeasement, right?
Yeah, if you're shopping for peas that day, you hit the jackpot. If you need
Anything
black
else?
beans, anything else, green beans, you miss out. So I go to the next aisle and it's empty again. So I go back to the front of the store. One of them just kind of nods with their head. I walk out, and that was part of my culture shock to see this is the fruit of a command economy, a centralized system that is broken and does not work.
Yeah.
And the bread factory, until private, by 1995, there were private bakeries opening up and selling things for 50% to double what the government was charging. But their bread was significantly, it was better. And so
it kind of sounds like a Monty Python. Kind of sounds like a Monty Python skit, going in. We haven't got that. We haven't got that cheese. Oh, what about this? No, we haven't got that cheese either. Keep going down the list. And it's like,
any type of blue-gray peas you'd like. You can have peas in any color you want as long as it's blue-gray. And
so you eventually started to see some private companies coming in a few years after the fall of Ceausescu and the central government, right?
And I mean, one of the things you saw a lot of what they called nonstop stores was like sort of like a 7-Eleven, and it'd be the size of a walk-in closet or a small bedroom, and these little shops were popping up all over the place. And I remember I was on an eternal quest for disposable diapers, having an infant. And so I would stop in because they were bringing things in from Germany and other countries sort of on a gray market basis. And they were doing quite well. And they had loaves of bread. So I stuck a loaf of bread in my bag. And as I had gone in, I had looked up at the chalkboard above the cashier's head, and it said bread 72 lei. And so put the bread in my bag, put 72 lei in a person's hand, and the person just left their hand open. And I said, is that not the right amount? And they just kind of, with the cigarette, pointed up. So I look up the chalkboard, and it's now 78 lei. So in the 3 or 4 minutes I had been in the store, the price went from 72 to 78.
Wow.
And that was kind of my intro into develop an interest into Austrian economics and, and to understand inflation, hyperinflation. That the average American citizen just does not have, unless they lived through the Great Depression, they just don't have that kind of framework. And
well,
so
I think it's been said, Mike, I think it's been said, experience is an expensive school, but it's the only one a fool will attend. I think we're all about to get a postgraduate degree in hyperinflation is what I think is coming along, but hopefully I'm wrong. So how did you wind up eating? How did you found food in these other markets? We were talking about what people were doing in the rural area to survive.
And
give some information.
One example, the government meat markets, the quality was not to be, couldn't compare with anything here in the U.S. And so I was bemoaning the fact that we could not find any beef. And my wife was expecting again. This is about maybe a year and a half later. And so this veteran missionary who had been working in the country for over a decade, doing underground seminary training and whatnot, he said, all right, get 60 Deutschmarks and I'll pick you up at 6 a.m. on Saturday morning. So we drove out into the countryside. Now this is in the Transylvania region, and you get outside the city and it gets pretty rural, wild, there's bears and wolves and whatnot, but we drive about an hour, we come over a mountainside, and in this little valley is a cabin with smoke coming out of the chimney, And as we get closer, there's a farmer wearing homemade shoes, and his clothing looked homemade, and he was butchering a calf. And I provided him with 60 Deutschmarks. The other missionary gave him 60 Deutschmarks. That was probably close to, for him, probably 6 months' wages.
Wow.
And we brought home the meat, and I then cut it up, and we had wonderful veal for the next several months. And so when you had the connections to people in the rural areas, that was the lifeline, and everything was rationed to those who lived in the cities. And those who had connections in the rural areas, who had family, parents, grandparents in the villages, they would often on Friday, they would get off of their factory job, they'd load up the car, and they'd go spend a weekend in the country. And then Sunday afternoon, they would load their vehicle with whatever they could carry: live lambs, freshly harvested vegetables.
Wow. So
Name it.
that brings up a question. You know, when I look at this and I say, well, you know, the cities, they can't find any food. The stores are empty. There is food out there in the country, but they kind of restrained from going out there and just taking everything from these farmers, as you might think would be their instinct. Why? Because they understand they'd be killing the goose that laid the golden egg? Is that really what kind of, did these people suffer any, raids from the government police, or, raids from people trying to steal stuff off of their farms to a large extent? I'm sure that they had some of that happening, but I mean, it wasn't massive confiscation of the farm produce and livestock, because they kind of realized that they needed to have that as an emergency valve, right? Would you say that was the case?
That's correct. And the authorities, everybody lived on the gray market. There was the official market, and then there was the gray market, where everybody, if you wanted, sheep cheese, or you wanted other specific products, you needed to have a source. So everybody bartered and traded on that market, even the authorities. And so it was sort of an underground economy, and that continued to grow.
So just kind of out of a sense of, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think the authorities learned, based on what happened next door in Ukraine during the Holodomor, that wiping out your farmer peasant class, the kulaks, that does not turn out well for the people, for the nation.
Has your news been censored, banned over and over again? Has vital information been held prisoner by mainstream and anti-social media? It's the duty of every thinking person to make the great escape to thedavidknightshow.com. There you'll find links to live streams, videos, audio podcasts, and support links. Live stream the show at DLive and every Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. Eastern. Videos at BitChute and YouTube. New audio podcast, The Real David Knight Show, at Podbean, iTunes, Stitcher, iHeart, Spotify, and more. But even though there's a light at the end of the tunnel, without your support, the show will run out of gas. The links to support the show are at thedavidknightshow.com, to donate via Subscribestar, donate via or donate via Cash App, Bitcoin, or P.O. Box. Our sincere thanks to all of you who have stood with us to get this far. Please don't forget to share the links and pray for the country as well as our family.